Pan's Labyrinth, The Labyrinth of the Faun, by Guillermo del Toro and Cornelia Funke. Copyright 2019. Publisher, Catherine Teagan Books, an imprint of HarperCollins Publishers. Read to you by Scandal. 1. The Forest and the Fairy. There once was a forest in the north of Spain, so old that it could tell stories long past and forgotten by men. The trees anchored so deeply in the moss-covered soil, they laced the bones of the dead with their roots while their branches reached for the stars. So many things lost, the leaves were murmuring as 3 black cars came driving down the unpaved road that cut through fern and moss. But all things lost can be found again, the trees whispered. It was the year 1944, and the girl was sitting in one of the cars, next to her pregnant mother. Didn't understand what the trees whispered. Her name was Ophelia, and she knew everything about the pain of loss, although she was only 13 years old. Her father had just died a year ago, and Ophelia missed him so terribly that at times her heart felt like an empty box with nothing but the echo of her pain in it. She often wondered whether her mother felt the same, but she couldn't find the answer in her pale face.
As white as snow, as red as blood, as black as coal,
Ophelia's father used to say when he looked at her mother, his voice soft with tenderness.
You look so much like her, Ophelia. Lost.
They had been driving for hours, farther and farther away from everything Ophelia knew, deeper and deeper into this never-ending forest, to meet the man her mother had chosen to be Ophelia's new father. Ophelia called him the Wolf, and she didn't want to think about him. But even the trees seemed to whisper his name. The only piece of home Ophelia had been able to take with her were some of her books. She closed her fingers firmly around one in her lap, caressing the cover. When she opened the book, the white pages were so bright against the shadows that filled the forest, and the words they offered granted shelter and comfort. The letters were like footprints in the snow, a wide, white landscape, untouched by pain, unharmed by memories too dark to keep, too sweet to let go of.
Why did you bring all those books, Ophelia?
We'll be in the country. The car ride had paled her mother's face even more. The car ride and the baby she was carrying. She grabbed the book from Ophelia's hands, and all the comforting words fell silent. You are too old for fairy tales, Ophelia. You need to start looking at the world. Her mother's voice was like a broken bell. Ophelia couldn't remember her ever sounding like that when her father was still alive.
Oh, we'll be late,
her mother sighed, pressing her handkerchief to her lips. You will not like that. She moaned, and Ophelia leaned forward to grab the driver's shoulder. Stop! She called. Stop the car! Don't you see? My mother is sick. The driver throttled the engine with a grunt. Wolves. That's what they were, these soldiers accompanying them. Man-eating wolves. Her mother said fairy tales didn't have anything to do with the world, but Ophelia knew better. They had taught her everything about it. She climbed out of the car while her mother stumbled to the side of the road and vomited into the ferns. They grew as densely between the trees as an ocean of feathery fronds, from which gray-barked trunks emerged like creatures reaching up from the sunken world below. The 2 other cars had stopped as well, and the forest was swarming with gray uniforms. The trees didn't like it. Ophelia could sense it. Serrano, the commanding officer, came to check on her mother. He was a tall, bulky man who talked too loudly and wore his uniform like a theater costume. Her mother asked him for water in her broken bell voice, and Ophelia walked a little way down the unpaved road. Water, the trees whispered. Earth. Sun. The fern fronds brushed Ophelia's dress like green fingers, and she lowered her gaze when she stepped on a stone. It was gray, like the soldiers' uniforms, placed in the middle of the road as if someone had lost it there. Her mother was once again vomiting behind her. Why does it make women sick to bring children into the world? Ophelia bent down and closed her fingers around the stone. Time had covered it in moss, but when Ophelia brushed it off, she saw it was flat and smooth, and that someone had carved an eye on it. A human eye. Ophelia looked around. All she could see were 3 withered stone columns, almost invisible in the high ferns. The gray rock from which they were carved was covered with strange concentric patterns, and the central column had an ancient corroded stone face gazing out into the forest. Ophelia couldn't resist. She stepped off the road and walked toward it, although her shoes were wet with dew after just a few steps, and thistles clung to her dress. The face was missing an eye, just like a puzzle missing a piece, waiting to be solved. Ophelia gripped the eye stone and stepped closer. Underneath the nose, chiseled with straight lines into the gray surface, a gaping mouth showed withered teeth. Ophelia stumbled back, when between them a winged body, as thin as a twig, stirred, pointing its long, quivering tentacles at her. Insect legs emerged from the mouth, and the creature, bigger than Ophelia's hand, hastily scuttled up the column. Once it reached the top, it raised its spindly front legs and started gesturing at her. It made Ophelia smile. It seemed like such a long time since she'd last smiled. Her lips weren't used to it anymore. "Who are you?" she whispered. The creature waved its front legs once more and uttered a few melodic clicking sounds. Maybe it was a cricket. Did crickets look like this? Or was it a dragonfly? Ophelia wasn't sure. She had been raised in a city, between walls built from stones that had neither eyes nor faces, nor gaping mouths. "Ophelia!" The creature spread its wings. Ophelia followed it with her eyes as it flew away. Her mother was standing just a few steps down the road, Officer Serrano by her side. "Look at your shoes!" her mother chided, with that soft resignation her voice held so often now. Ophelia looked down. Her damp shoes were covered with mud, but she still felt the smile on her lips. "I think I saw a fairy," she said. Yes, that's what the creature was. Ophelia was sure. But her mother wouldn't listen. Her name was Carmen Cardoso. She was 32 years old and already a widow, and she didn't remember how it felt to look at anything without despising it, without being afraid of it. All she saw was a world that took what she loved and ground it to dust between its teeth. So as Carmen Cardoso loved her daughter, loved her very much, she had married again. This world was ruled by men. Her child didn't understand that yet, and only a man would be able to keep them both safe. Ophelia's mother didn't know it, but she also believed in a fairy tale. Carmen Cardoso believed the most dangerous tale of all, the one of the prince who would save her. The winged creature that had been waiting for Ophelia in the column's gaping mouth knew all of this. She knew many things, but she was not a fairy, at least not in the sense we like to think of them. Only her master knew her true name, for in the magic kingdom to know a name was to own the being that carried it. From the branch of a fir tree, she watched Ophelia and her mother get back into the car to continue their journey. She had waited for this girl for a long time, this girl who had lost so much and would have to lose so much more to find what was rightfully hers. It wouldn't be easy to help her, but that was the task her master had given her, and he didn't take it lightly when his orders weren't followed. Oh no, he didn't. Deeper and deeper into the forest the cars drove, with the girl and her mother and the unborn child. And the creature Ophelia had named a fairy spread her insect wings, folded her 6 spindly legs, and followed the caravan. 2. All the shapes evil takes. Evil seldom takes shape immediately. It is often little more than a whisper at first, a glance, a betrayal, but then it grows and takes root, still invisible, unnoticed. Only fairy tales give evil a proper shape. The big bad wolves, the evil kings, the demons, and devils. Ophelia knew that the man she would soon have to call father was evil. He had the smile of the Cyclops, Ojankanu, and the cruelty of the monsters Quegal and Nuberu resting in his dark eyes. Creatures she had met in her fairy tale books, but her mother didn't see his true shape. People often grow blind when they get older, and maybe Carmen Cardoso didn't notice the wolfish smile because Capitan Vidal was handsome and always impeccably dressed in his gala uniform, boots and gloves. Because she wished so badly for protection, maybe her mother mistook his bloodlust for power and his brutality for strength. Capitan Vidal looked at his pocket watch. The glass face was marred by a crack, but the hands underneath still told the time, and they indicated that the caravan was late. 15 minutes, muttered Vidal, who, like all monsters, like death, was always punctual. Yes, they were late, just as Carmen had feared. When they finally arrived at the old mill Vidal had chosen to serve as his headquarters. Vidal hated the forest. He hated everything that didn't keep a proper order, and the trees were far too willing to hide the men he had come here to hunt. They fought the very darkness Vidal served and admired, and he had come to the old forest to break them. Oh yes, Ophelia's new father loved to break the bones of all those he considered weak, to spill their blood, and to give new order to their messy, miserable world. He greeted the caravan, smiling, but Ophelia saw the contempt in his eyes as he welcomed them in the dusty yard where once upon a time peasants of the surrounding villages had delivered their grain to the miller. Her mother, though, smiled at him and allowed the wolf to touch her belly swollen with his child. She even gave in when he told her to sit in a wheelchair like a broken doll. Ophelia watched it all from the back seat of the car, despising the prospect of offering the wolf her hand as her mother had told her to. But finally she climbed out, to not leave her mother alone with him, pressing her books against her chest like a shield made from paper and words. Ophelia! The wolf crunched her name between his thin lips into something as broken as her mother, and stared at her extended left hand. It's the other hand, Ophelia, he said softly. Remember. He was wearing black leather gloves that creaked when he enclosed Ophelia's hand in a grip as fierce as a poacher's trap. Then he turned his back on her, as if he'd already forgotten it. Mercedes! He called out to a woman who was helping the soldiers unload the cars. Get their luggage! Mercedes was slim and pale. She had raven-black hair and dark, liquid eyes. Ophelia thought she looked like a princess, pretending to be a peasant's daughter, or perhaps an enchantress, though Ophelia wasn't sure of which kind, good or evil. Mercedes and the men carried her mother's suitcases to the mill house. Ophelia thought it looked lost and sad, as if it missed being a mill grinding fresh grain. Now it was overrun with soldiers, swarming around its withered stone walls like locusts. Their tents and trucks were everywhere, filling the wide yard surrounded by stables, a barn, and the mill itself. Gray uniforms, a sad old house, and a forest filled with shadows. Ophelia yearned to go home so badly she could barely breathe. But there was no home without her father. She felt tears welling up behind her eyes when she suddenly noticed between sacks stacked a few feet away a pair of wings catching the sunlight as though made of paper-thin glass. It was the fairy. Forgetting her sadness, Ophelia ran after her when she made a beeline for the trees behind the mill. The little creature was so fast that Ophelia soon stumbled over her own feet as she chased her, dropping all her books. But when Ophelia picked them up, wiping the dirt from their covers, she saw the fairy clinging to the bark of a nearby tree, waiting for her. She was. Oh, yes. She had to make sure the girl followed her. Wait, no! She had to halt her steps again. Ophelia was staring at a huge arch that had appeared between the trees, spanning the gap between two ancient walls. A horned head stared down from the arch with empty eyes and an empty mouth, as if it were trying to swallow the world. The gaze of those eyes seemed to make everything vanish. The mill, the soldiers, the wolf, even Ophelia's mother. Come in, the crumbling walls seemed to say. Ophelia could see faded engraved letters below the head, but she didn't know their meaning. In consulis nostris fatum nostrum es, the words read. In our choices lie our fate. The fairy had disappeared, and when Ophelia stepped through the arch, it cast a cold shadow on her skin. Turn around, something in her warned, but she didn't. Sometimes it is good to listen. Sometimes it is not. Ophelia wasn't sure she had a choice, anyway. Her feet did the walking all by themselves. The corridor that opened behind the arch narrowed just after a few steps, until Ophelia could touch the walls on either side simply by stretching out her arms. She dragged her hands over the withered stones while she kept walking. They were so cold despite the heat of the day. A few more steps, and she reached a corner. Another corridor opened in front of her, leading left and then right toward another corner. It is a labyrinth. Ophelia spun around. Mercedes was standing behind her. The shawl draped across her shoulders looked as if she had woven it from woolen leaves. If she was an enchantress, she was a beautiful one, not old and withered as they mostly looked in Ophelia's books. But she knew from the tales that enchantresses often didn't wear their true faces. It's just a pile of old stones, Mercedes said. Very old, older than the mill. These walls have been here forever, long before the mill was built. You shouldn't come in here. You could get lost. It has happened before. I'll tell you the story one day, if you want to hear it. Mercedes, the Capitan needs you. A soldier's harsh voice ordered from behind the mill. I'm coming, Mercedes called back. She smiled at Ophelia. There were secrets in her smile, but Ophelia liked her. She liked her very much. You heard that? Your father needs me. Mercedes started walking back to the arch. He is not my father, Ophelia called after her. He is not! Mercedes slowed. Ophelia ran to her side, and they walked through the arch, leaving the cold stones and the horned face with the empty eyes behind. My father was a tailor, Ophelia said. He was killed in the war. There were tears again. They always came when Ophelia talked about him. She couldn't help it. He made my dress, and the blouse my mother wears. He made the most beautiful clothes, more beautiful than the princesses wear in my books. Capitan Vidal is not my father." "You've made that very clear," Mercedes said gently, putting her arm around Ophelia's shoulders. "Come now, I'll take you to your mother. I'm sure she's already looking for you." Her arm felt warm and strong. "Isn't my mother beautiful?" Ophelia asked. "It is the baby who makes her sick. Do you have a brother?" "I do," Mercedes replied. "You'll see. You will love your little brother. Very much. You won't be able to help it." She smiled once again. There was a sadness in her eyes. Ophelia saw it. Mercedes seemed to know about losing things, too. Sitting atop the stone arch, the fairy watched them walk back to the mill, the woman and the girl, spring and summer side by side. The girl would come back. The fairy would make sure of that. Very soon. As soon as her master wished. 3. Just a mouse. Yes, Mercedes had a brother. Pedro was one of the men hiding in the forest. A maqui, as they called themselves, a resistance fighter, hiding from the very soldiers Mercedes cooked and cleaned for. Capitan Vidal and his officers were planning the hunt for those men when Mercedes walked in with the bread, cheese, and wine he had ordered. At one time, the table on which they'd spread their map used to serve meals to the miller and his family. Now all it served was death. Death and fear. The flames dancing in the fireplace painted shadows of knives and rifles onto the whitewashed walls and the faces bending over the map. Mercedes put her tray down and cast an unsuspicious glance at the marked army positions. "The guerrillas stick to the forest because it's hard to track them there." Vidal's voice was as expressionless as his face. "The scum know the terrain much better than we do. We'll therefore block all access to the woods, here and here." He brought his black-gloved finger down on the map like a missile. "Pay attention, Mercedes, and tell your brother what they are planning, or he'll be dead in a week. Food, medicine, we'll store it all, right here." Vidal pointed at the spot that marked the hill. "We need to force them down from the hills. That way, they'll come to us. Here, Mercedes. They'll store it all here." She took her time laying the food out on the table, glad that she was completely invisible to them, just a maid, just part of the room like the chairs and the firewood. "We'll set up 3 new command posts, here, here, and here." Vidal placed bronze markers on the map. Mercedes didn't take her eyes off his gloved fingers. That's what she was, the eyes and ears of the rabbits they hunted, as silent and invisible as a mouse. "Mercedes!" She forgot to breathe when the black glove grabbed her shoulder. Vidal's eyes were narrow with suspicion. "He is always suspicious, Mercedes," she thought, calming her racing heart. He liked to watch his gaze spread fear on a face, but she'd played this game often enough to not give herself away. Just a mouse. Invisible. She'd be done for if he ever came to believe that she was a cat or a vixen. "Ask Dr. Ferreira to come down." "Yes, senor." She bent her head to make herself small. Most men didn't want a woman to be tall. Vidal was no exception. 3 command posts, and food and medicine stored at the mill. Now that would come in handy. 4. A rose on a dark mountain. Dr. Ferreira was a good man, a gentle soul. That much was apparent to Ophelia the moment he walked into her mother's room. One can spot kindness as clearly as cruelty. It spreads light and warmth, and the doctor seemed filled with both. "This will help you sleep," he told her mother as he added a few drops of amber liquid to a glass of water. Her mother hadn't argued with him when he advised her to stay in bed for a few days. It was a huge wooden bed, with plenty of room for her and Ophelia to share. Her mother hadn't been well at all since they'd come to this miserable place. Her forehead was wet with sweat, and pain etched fine lines into her beautiful face. Ophelia was worried, but it comforted her to watch the doctor's calm hands prepare the draught. "Just 2 drops," he said, handing Ophelia the small brown bottle so she could close it. "You'll see it will help her." Her mother could barely swallow the water without gagging. "You need to drink all of it," Dr. Ferreira softly urged. "Very good." His voice was as warm as the blankets on the bed, and Ophelia wondered why her mother hadn't fallen in love with a man just like the doctor. He reminded her of her late father, just a little bit. Ophelia just sat down on the side of the bed when Mercedes came into the room. "He wants you downstairs," she said to Dr. Ferreira. He. Nobody spoke his name. The doll. It sounded like a stone thrown through a window, each letter a piece of broken glass. Capitan. That's what most of them called him. But Ophelia still thought Wolf fit him much better. Don't hesitate to call me, the doctor said to her mother as he closed his bag. Day or night, you or your young nurse, he added, smiling at Ophelia. Then he left with Mercedes, and Ophelia was alone for the first time with her mother in this old house, smelling of cold winters and the sadness of people from ages past. She liked to be alone with her mother. She always had. But then the wolf had come. Her mother drew her closer. My young nurse. She pushed her hand under Ophelia's arm with a tired but happy smile. Close the doors and turn off the light, canino. Even though she'd be at her mother's side, Ophelia dreaded the prospect of sleeping in a strange room. But she did as she was told. She was reaching for the door latch when she saw the doctor standing on the landing with Mercedes. They didn't notice her, and Ophelia didn't want to eavesdrop, but she couldn't help listening. To listen. After all, that's what being a child is about. Learning about adults' secrets means learning to understand their world and how to survive it. You have to help us, doctor, Mercedes was whispering. Come with me and see him. The wound's not healing. His leg is getting worse. This is all I could get, the doctor said quietly, handing Mercedes a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. I am sorry. Mercedes took the parcel, but the despair on her face frightened Ophelia. Mercedes seemed so strong, like someone who would protect her in this house filled with loneliness and the ghosts of the past. The Capitan is waiting for you in his office. Mercedes straightened her back and didn't look at Dr. Ferreira as he descended the stairs. His steps were heavy, as if he felt guilty walking away from Mercedes' desperate face. Ophelia couldn't move. Secrets. They add to the darkness of the world, but they also make you want to find out more. Ophelia was still standing by the door when Mercedes turned. Her eyes widened with fear the moment she saw Ophelia, and she hastily hid the parcel under her shawl, while Ophelia's feet finally obeyed, and she stepped back to latch the door, wishing Mercedes would just forget she had seen her. Ophelia, come here, her mother called from the bed. At least the fire spread some light in the dark room, along with 2 flickering candles on the mantelpiece. Ophelia crawled into the bed and wrapped her arms around her mother. Just the 2 of them. Why hadn't that been enough? But her baby brother was already kicking in her mother's belly. What if he was like his father? Go away, Ophelia thought. Leave us alone. We don't need you, for she has me, and I take care of her. Heavens, your feet! They're frozen, her mother said. Her body felt so warm, maybe a bit too warm, but the doctor hadn't seemed too worried about the fever. Around them, the mill was moaning and creaking. It didn't want them. It wanted the miller back. Or maybe it wished to be alone with the forest, tree roots breaking through its walls, leaves covering its roof, until its stones and beams became part of the forest again. Are you afraid? Her mother whispered. A little, Ophelia whispered back. Another moan rose from the old walls, and the beams above them sighed as if someone was bending them. Ophelia pressed closer against her mother. She kissed Ophelia's hair, as black as her own. It's nothing, carino. It's nothing. Just the wind. Nights are very different here. In the city you hear cars, the tramway. Here the houses are so much older. They creak. Yes, they did. This time they both listened. It sounds as if the walls are speaking, doesn't it? Her mother hadn't held Ophelia like this since she had learned she was pregnant. Tomorrow I'm giving you a surprise. A surprise? Ophelia looked up at her mother's pale face. Yes. Ophelia felt so safe in her embrace, for the first time since... Since when? Since her father died. Since her mother met the wolf. Is it a book? She asked. Her father had often given her books. Sometimes he had even tailored clothes for them. Linen. To protect the binding, Ophelia, he would say. They bind them in very cheap fabric nowadays. This is better. Ophelia missed him so much. Sometimes it felt as if her heart were bleeding, and it wouldn't heal until she saw him again. A book? Her mother laughed softly. No, not a book. Something much better. Ophelia didn't remind her mother that, for her, there was nothing better than a book. Her mother wouldn't understand. She didn't make books her shelter or allow them to take her to another world. She could only see this world, and then, Ophelia thought, only sometimes. It was part of her mother's sadness to be earthbound. Books could have told her so much about this world, and about places far away, about animals and plants, about the stars. They could be windows and doors, paper wings to help her fly away. Maybe her mother had just forgotten how to fly, or maybe she'd never learned. Carmen closed her eyes. At least, when she was dreaming, she saw more than this world, didn't she? Ophelia wondered, pressing her cheek against her mother's chest. So close, their bodies fusing into one, as they had been before she was born. Ophelia could hear the tide of her mother's breath, the soft thumping of her heart beating so regularly, like a metronome against bone. "Why did you have to get married?" Ophelia whispered. As the words escaped her lips, part of her hoped that her mother was already asleep, but then the answer came. "I was alone for too long," her mother said, staring at the ceiling above them. The whitewash was cracked and lined with spiderwebs. "I was with you," Ophelia said. "You were not alone. I was always with you." Her mother continued to stare at the ceiling, suddenly seeming so far away. "When you're older, you'll understand. It wasn't easy for me, either. When your father—" She drew in her breath sharply and pressed her hand on her swollen belly. "Your brother is acting up again." Her mother's hand felt so hot when Ophelia covered it with her own. Yes, she could feel her brother too, and no, he wouldn't go away. He wanted to come out. "Tell him one of your stories," her mother gasped. "I'm sure that'll calm him down." Ophelia felt reluctant to share her stories with him, but finally she sat up. Under the white sheets her mother's body looked like a mountain covered in snow, her brother sleeping in its deepest cave. Ophelia put her head on the bump in the blanket, caressing it where her brother was moving, deep under her mother's skin. "Brother," she whispered, "brother of mine." Her mother hadn't given him a name yet. He would need one soon to get ready for this world. "Many, many years ago, in a sad, faraway land," Ophelia spoke in a soft, low voice, but she was sure he could hear her, "there was an enormous mountain made of black flint. Behind the mill, in the forest as dark and silent as the night, the creature Ophelia called the fairy spread her wings and followed the sound of the girl's voice, the words building a path of breadcrumbs through the night. And atop that mountain," Ophelia continued, "a magic rose blossomed every dawn. People said whoever plucked it would become immortal, but no one dared to go near it because its thorns were filled with poison. Oh, yes, there are many roses like that," the fairy thought as she flew toward the window behind which the girl was telling her story. When she slipped into the room, her wings fluttering as softly as Ophelia's voice, she saw them, the girl and her mother, holding each other against the darkness of the night outside. But the darkness inside the house was far more frightening, and the girl knew that it was fed by the man who'd brought them here. "People talked about all the pain the thorns of the rose could cause," Ophelia whispered to her unborn brother. "They warned each other that whoever climbed the mountain would die. It was so easy for them to believe in the pain and the thorns. Fear helped them believe that, but none of them dared to hope that in the end the rose would reward them with eternal life. They couldn't hope. They could not. And so the rose would wilt away night after night, unable to bequeath its gift to anyone." The fairy sat on the window-sill to listen. She was glad the girl knew about the thorns, as she and her mother had come to a very dark mountain. The man who ruled this mountain, oh yes, the fairy knew all about him, was sitting downstairs in his office, the room behind the mill's wheel, polishing the pocket watch of his father, another father who had died in another war. "The rose was forgotten and lost," Ophelia said, pressing her cheek to her mother's belly, "at the top of that cold, dark mountain, forever alone, until the end of time." She didn't know it, but she was telling her brother about his father. This preview has been created for you by License Candle Lit. Please like, comment, and subscribe for more quality book previews. Thank you!